Welcome everyone to this episode of The Big Picture. I'm your host Justine Wanda, and today with me,
Tom Mukhwana.
And with us today we have very special guests. We have George Yogo, who's the advisor, youth, gender, political affairs and external liaison, and the former advisor to Raila. And we also have Patrick Gathara, who's a Kenyan journalist. He's a cartoonist, he's an author, he's a commentator on regional and international affairs, joining us today. Welcome both to the show.
Thank you very much.
Simseme kitu kidogo jameni hata.
You said welcome, so we just said thank you.
Okay.
At least that was my teacher of English taught me.
So, to dwell sana, we'll get right into why this particular episode is very important. This last week has been very difficult for a lot of Kenyans around the country and even across the world, and people have been eulogizing and celebrating the life of the former Prime Minister Raila Odinga, who passed away in India of a heart attack. And this episode particularly matters because we've seen because Raila has been a significant figure in the Kenyan political scene, and for the people who agreed with him and loved him with all his work, and for the people who faulted his work because it was not a perfect depiction of what a democracy should be, whether you absolutely loved and adored him or whether you had a lot of tiffs with how he operated, this episode is the one to watch for why this matters. Welcome to the show again. So I'll start on a lighter note. We've seen the celebration of Luo culture over when Raila was being buried, and I just want us to get into how you guys felt seeing all that. And did you learn something? For the people who come from the culture, how did that make you feel? I'll go with you, George, first.
Well, I didn't see it. I experienced it firsthand because I was there. Mm-hmm. And I think we didn't do what we ought to have done as a community. He was given the bare minimum for a person of his stature. But if it was left for the customary kind of a burial, then it should have been very elaborate. Mm-hmm. But Raila Odinga, being what is referred to as the Agwambo, or the mysterious one, had his own plans and his own ways. So he made life very difficult for some of us. Because truthfully, by today, Raila Odinga shouldn't have been buried if we needed to be very elaborate about the customary procedures. Mm-hmm. But the little he was given, we are happy about it, but we could have given him more.
You can always give him more. We believe yes. Even after he's gone, the people who stay behind can always show up in those ways. And for you, Gathara?
I think that people did what they could in the time that
the shortest time possible.
Obviously, it was shrunk. There was talk of a will that specified that within 72 hours it should be buried, which is not necessarily a quote-unquote traditional thing. Mm. But I think there's a deeper issue here or question is what counts as traditional or cultural. And there's this idea people have that traditional is something that is fixed. People, Kitambo used to do this and they always did this, which is not true. Cultures change, they move around, people adapt different circumstances. And the fact is, lots of what we consider today as cultural will not be recognizable to people who were living 100 years ago. We've gone through colonialism, which has changed a lot of our ideas of even what our communities are. So I wouldn't be too stuck up on whether there was a faithful rendition of Luo culture. I remember this same argument had come when Ken Okoth died and he was cremated, and we had all this, it's not cultural, or there's something wrong with it. It's not. Cultures will evolve, they'll always change. And what we have now is not what we had then. So we have to be careful about sort of valorizing a cultural way of doing these burials. I think being stuck with certain sort of precepts of what used to be is not necessarily very helpful.
No point.
And for you, Tom?
I also think, well, as you both said, he was also a very, man who appreciated both worlds, the cultural world and the modernity now. And so he didn't stick to the culture all the time, I would say. Sometimes he would do things that if his great-granddad woke up and so be like, how are you doing this, my grandchild? But I believe aspects of his culture shone through that event, because Teroburu, for instance, that was huge online. People were speaking about how good it is. It didn't take center stage because a state burial is meant to have the military and all those honors and all those procedures and protocols. I think it shone through as much as you think, George, it did. Not in its fullness,
let me
but
be
it
very
did.
honest with you. One, I want to talk about somebody I've known for 20 years at very close levels. One, we didn't even have Teroburu, because Teroburu is done after 3 days after burial. So we can talk about it right now. But, and I'm also not talking about past traditions. I am talking about current traditions, a set precedents for elders of his stature. Some of those things could not be done. Why? Because unlike what most people believe, Raila did not believe in a lot of Luo traditions and customs. For example, Raila constantly fought people about feeding in funerals, the fundraisings in funerals. Raila never believed in them. And unlike what most people think, and that was the point of divergence, because there are certain things he didn't believe in. And that is why you find he's the one who wrote in his own will he has to be buried within 72 hours. That's a first of its kind. And so there are so many things. When Uduor died, for example, he said we shouldn't put up a committee to raise funds for him. Raila's funeral, we still couldn't raise money, whether the state was doing it or not, because he didn't agree with that concept. So there's so many things that Raila did not believe in. He was a Luo, known to be traditionalist, but he had, I think most probably because of his orientation and exposure, there are several ways that he departed from the Luo traditions. And so if we were supposed to do what is done for the elders, then it would have most probably been very elaborate. But as it now, that is current traditions, not the past traditions, but as current traditions.
Yeah, I think I mean, for me, the use of the word traditions is what implies that this is things that were done in the past. So there's current practices, there's how people honor others, and that in itself is something that evolves, that keeps changing. So I'm not too sort of stuck up in whether what was done used to be, done in the past. But there's one thing you said I think I need to contest a little bit. There's this sort of perception of this what is modern and there's what is, cultural. As if what's cultural is not modern. These are all things being done in the modern age. So it is modern by definition.
That's true.
So we shouldn't really sort of try and see it as an attempt to reach back into the past. The past is gone. It is what we are doing today. So it's not a choice in between this and the other. Now, I agree with you that there is sort of a formal aspect of it because it's a state funeral. There's also a westernized sort of aspect to it, that people aspire to, which is fine. They can choose to adopt that. It doesn't mean that they are less modern when they don't. It's just various ways of being modern, and I think we should be comfortable with that.
I agree. And I think I'll say my favorite moments were when, for a lot of people who are seeking to understand what was going on, there are people who took their time to contextualize. I know not everyone has to take time out of their day to explain what is going on, but because it was also a learning moment for a lot of younger people, a lot of people who are probably not removed, but don't have a grasp of the day-to-day and what goes into making such a funeral so remarkable and such a drawing culturally. I think my favorite moment was all the people taking time to at least educate, so that for anyone who's interacting with the culture is aware this is what is going on, and also just for the knowledge of how diverse the country is, and not the place that you come from does not dictate how everyone lives. And I think that's my favorite part about this journey.
Something for you. In Luo culture, if you already in what we refer to as golodala, that means you've left your father's home and built your own home. You should not be buried in your father's home. You should be buried on the right side of your house in your compound. I don't know whether you understand. But now, where was Raila buried? They more or less westernized their tradition, and they have a burial site, a common burial site. That's where the father was buried. That's where the mother was buried. That's where Fidel, the son, was buried. That's where he was buried. You understand? So there was a complete departure from what tradition holds. For example, a lady who is not married and has attained the age of marriage dies, she's not buried in the compound. She's buried outside the compound. A son who already has a home should be buried in his home. So the body should not be taken to the father's home. But you see, Fidel's body was taken to the father's home, then later on moved to the grandfather's place for burial. Raila's body arrived and was put within the compound outside the house, and then later on transferred to the father's compound for burial. So you see, those are the departures we're saying. But if we were to do what would be regarded as traditional, then that is already breaking the tradition. Because why would somebody who is an elder of his stature be buried outside his compound? Yes.
Yeah, good points.
Okay, so we're going to move on to who Raila was. Raila was born January 7th, 1945 in Maseno to the late Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who was also the first vice president of the country, and his mother, Mary Juma Odinga. And he grew up there. He went to Maranda. He ended up in East Germany for university. And I just wanted to get a proper context of how all of you, what was your first interaction with Raila and his story?
I think we should start with George because of his
Yeah.
knowledge of Raila.
Because you also said you've known him for 20 years. I was just like, I thought you were going to take it and run with it, but yeah.
Well, my first ever interaction with Raila Odinga was in 1995. 95. In 1995, I actually didn't know Raila Odinga, but I had a very strange encounter that made me find out who Raila Odinga was. This is laughable. When I was in high school, I was a member of a karate club. So my captain invited me over to Kisumu. I lived in the village. I was actually raised in Kisii. I went to Ongiche Primary School that is in Kisii. Was called to Sameta Boys High School. I couldn't afford fee, dropped out. Later on, found myself in Koyo Secondary School. So that's where I met Bob. So Bob came from Kisumu, an estate known as Arena. So then Bob invites me over to Arena. That should have been the third time or so I was getting to Kisumu town. So he gave me directions to Arena. When I got to Arena, I found a group of boys. I was led into a room. It looked more or less like a hall, and I met a group of boys there. And when I got there, I didn't even sit. They said, well, the team is complete. We can move. So I was like, Bob, where are we moving to? And then before he could even answer, they were handing us buttons, what we would refer to in my mother tongue as lodkwer, those buttons that are used for djembes.
Right.
Yeah, so they were handing over those things to us. So I picked one and we were moving. So Bob told me, let's move, I will explain to you. We didn't go far, we were being stoned. That was around 11 in the morning. So I ended up in a fight that we fought for the whole day. Up to around 5 in the evening when Raila drove in, driving a tractor through State House Lodge to his compound, the father's compound that is just behind the State House Lodge. So in the process, I was seeking to understand who is Raila Odinga. Then I'm told there was a mayor in town known as Oile, that Raila had come to town and Oile had refused that Raila could not get into town because Oile was basically a state operative, a very powerful mayor. As a journalist, you definitely have a story of Oile. So Raila moved back to Nairobi and he came back to prepare himself back to Kisumu. So I became part of an army without knowing. I was part of this army and I fought this battle without knowing. And apparently when Raila drove his tractor past the State House Lodge into the compound, we all celebrated it. We were very jubilant that we had overcome the enemy, and Raila finally became the conqueror of the day. So that was the point of interest for me. I sought to know who was Raila Odinga. And I had very great admiration for him. I saw the sacrifice that everybody had, the commitment that everybody had, and he became a darling to me. I was like, I would really one day want to be like this man. Don't forget, I fought that battle without knowing why we were fighting. Exactly. And I fought for the whole day.
Do you think that was wise? Yes.
I fought for the... If you ask me today, a couple of times I have this discussion with my wife, and I'm like, what if I died that day? I didn't even know I was there. I didn't even know who I was fighting for. The truth is, I didn't know what... I knew Jaramogi Oginga Odinga because I met him in history books. But I didn't know Raila Odinga. So I was encountering Raila Odinga for the very first time in the battlefront. Now, after that time, I now got interested in Raila Odinga and started following these young people that were following Raila Odinga. So I became one of the ground foot soldiers of Raila Odinga. And from that day, I have never looked back.
Okay.
Yes.
Pause, just so we can go together and Tom before I come back to the foot soldier. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, for me, I think I encountered Raila as most Kenyans would. I didn't have a personal sort of relationship with him. I don't actually, I think I've only met him maybe once or twice, like kind of face to face. And it's just really being somewhere where he was rather than I've gone to sit with him and have a discussion, although we had a chat once. I think he sort of came onto the national consciousness, as you, if you will, in the aftermath of the 82 coup when he was detained. Obviously, before that, for people who are kind of older than me, they would have known him from his days in university as a lecturer, etc. Sort of the push and pull and what he'd been doing there. But I think really when he starts to capture attention is when you get into the fight for multi-party democracy in the early 90s. By 92 we have that, big player in his father's corner when they were running Ford, and I think after his father dies, when he splits out with Ford K and then NDP, you've got sort of, he starts building his own, I think, really large public persona, and I think it was really, at the time he was sort of a big fish amongst many other big fish. And I think it was really after he stood up to Moi after the what they used to call cooperation, and when they hooked up with NDP and KANU, and then he led the walkout of KANU that essentially led to the collapse of KANU and the appointment of Kibaki, is when he really sort of became, I think, a man in his own stature, sort of somebody who was holding up things. Now, obviously, George would know better what was happening before because he'd been interacting with him at the time, but for me, that's when he really became a big national figure, and things. Obviously, his fights with Kibaki and then with Uhuru and then with Ruto became sort of legendary, and he built up this persona of the person who was always standing almost against the state, at every point. So I think for lots of people, that's how they would know him, as a fearless challenge to the power of the state.
The reason you've said that's how a lot of people came to know him. Tom is fairly young. Tom, how did you interact with Raila and his story? Because I don't think it's like George's story where you are fighting. No, yeah.
I like you, Gathara, I met him through my work, journalism. The most at that time, once I entered the newsroom. But before that, it was through hearing people speak. I'd say that should be 13, consciously hearing about him. Between 2007 and 2013, I obviously cannot remember. I didn't fight, so I can't remember picking up a baton for him when I was that young. But I think at that time, that's when I remember hearing his name first, and then he sort of stayed there because he was always there. And then years after that, I started reporting on him and listening to his speeches more intently, and that's when I started building a profile in my head of who Raila was over that period. Yeah, Justine?
I came from a house where what the kids would call a stan, like my household was like a bunch of stans for Raila. Like everyone loved him, everyone spoke about him, everyone spoke about his politics. I think, I don't remember the exact point I heard the name Raila, but I just know in our house.
You've just known Raila.
Yes, like you just hear that. Like every other thing I knew about him and his work followed things that had already been told in my family. So I had to discover like the truth about his work and every single thing he did, and like him becoming a political prisoner and all these different details about his life after I had heard his name. So it wasn't like through his work, it was because my family were just fangirls. We're like, we love him so much. That was what my house felt like. And I think there was a draw-in that made him very popular. The fights that he was in, the movements that he was a part of. And to you, George, as someone who said you were a foot soldier, and what does that mean, considering like, and also just to contextualize how he started out in this journey, how he showed up, because he was working at KEBS, I think in the 1970s. Yeah. And then around that time...
He actually initiated, he was the founder of Kenya Bureau of Standards.
He was? KEBS, really?
Yes.
Okay.
After he started he was trying to put together the spectra.
Yes.
And there were no standards. So that is how he spearheaded the idea of us having a standards body that would help him do what he was doing, and became the director of Kenya Bureau of Standards.
Okay.
But I think Gathara forgot to mention that what really propelled Raila Odinga was the death of his father. He has done all this before, but you see, he was under the shadow of his father. So the death of his father actually propelled him to the public limelight in two fronts. One, some of my people may not believe this, but I don't think that his father considered him a formidable force to inherit him. And so his father literally left him nothing, because the Luo nation was bequeathed to James Orengo, while the party was given to Kijana Wamalwa. So Raila, in his own right, decided to fight for the party. If you can remember the NDC that happened in Thika, the botched NDC in Thika, where some of the men with whom I worked carried pangas to defend Raila Odinga. Recently, I saw the clip running around. Now, that is when most people decided to find out who is this Raila Odinga who could live to go fight in Kikuyu land. And he went to Thika and fought his way through. When he lost the party, that was the first front. The second front, and Raila is the only member of parliament who has stepped down from his seat when he changed the parties. And he decided to seek a fresh mandate from the people. That again showed a different person altogether. We know of leaders who were appointed and in their own statement said, I would rather die than resign. But this is a man who said, I would resign and seek a fresh mandate from the people. If truly they voted for me, they can again vote for me. Now, that is one of the things that really propelled Raila Odinga to the limelight. And the reason why he did that and also sacrificed the better part of his life in prison or detention for this country is what distinguishes him from the rest of the politicians. I once said in one media interview that what we have today is politics of convenience. It is circumstantial positioning, depending on which side of the bread is buttered, or who butters my bread. But Raila Odinga's kind of politics was basically principled. He stood for specific ideals. He fought for those ideals. He disagreed with his colleagues amicably, but Raila would go for what he believes in is right and serves the people. And because he made us also understand what he was going after, Raila never took a step without talking to his people. And the truth is, of the politicians I have worked with, I've worked with William Ruto, I've worked with Kalonzo Musyoka, I have worked with our PCS, the Prime Cabinet Secretary. Most of these politicians that are there the moment they worked with Raila Odinga, we worked very closely with them. And I could tell you for a fact that Raila stood out. He is one kind of a person who would listen to everyone. I once had a statement by one Archbishop Benson in the House of Blessed Memories, and he said, there are two people that you must listen to, the wise and the foolish. And when he was asked, he said, when you listen to the wise, you learn wisdom from them. When you listen to the foolish, they teach you how not to be a fool. So Raila listened to everybody. As long as you got an opportunity to talk to him, he would pay attention to you. So that endeared him to the people. During my years of political service, I learned that one thing that you need to be a great politician is building a critical mass. And critical masses are built through the process in which you endear yourself to the hearts of the people. And so Raila managed to completely endear himself to a larger population, to their hearts. So whether you knew him in person, the truth is this, almost 99% of people who fought for Raila Odinga didn't know him in person.
Right. That's true. I mean, it's hard to know our politicians in person anyway. But I think I have to be careful to temper this this picture of Raila as painted, you know, as constantly principled, as constantly popular. You know, he was in a sense quite a polarizing figure. You speak about your family, and in my family, he was almost seen as the devil. You know, in many cases. You know, and so there was this sort of, I think, push and pull about him. And it was a lot of it wasn't about, I think, him personally, although there's a lot of people who are kind of like suspicious of his ability, his charm, his charisma, his ability to mobilize. I think that, for a lot of people that was kind of quite scary, you know. But I also think that he was captured, or he was part of a politics that was very, from the start, both ethnically tinged. So already he was fixed within our political firmament as a Luo politician, you know, as opposed as a national one, you know. And in the minds of many people, or I would say many Kikuyus, for example, they would see him primarily, you know, as a carrier of Luo. And when he said Kibaki Tosha, they were all very happy with him, you know. And then when you post Kibaki, you know, for example, during the referendum, etc., he became the devil, you know, in 2007, you know, the same. So it was really, the image of him was really, I think, held hostage by how our politics was played out on the ethnic base of that politics. The second thing I would say is it was also held hostage to the idea of power. And power seen as not something that needed to be controlled, but as something that you needed so as to effect change. And this goes all the way back to his dad, to Kenyatta, Jomo Kenyatta, and that generation of politicians, people like Tom Mboya, etc., who would say very good things, very nice things about democracy and stuff, but what they were really interested in was power. So Jaramogi famously at Lancaster was saying that what we should strive for is power. Not that we shouldn't care too much about the Constitution. Get power, because when we have power, we can't change the Constitution. So he wasn't seeing the Constitution as something that regulates power. It's the other way around. Power regulates what becomes in the Constitution. And I think in a lot of ways, Raila followed in that tradition. And that I find quite disturbing. And it is a line that goes through lots of what Kenyan politicians do, is they think compromises are okay if you get power, because once we get power, then we can effect the changes we want. But those changes, once people are in power, are very rarely to our benefit. You know, I think we've been voting since the 60s. You know, we have seen that lots of the people who we put in charge constantly keep turning away, you know, from us, from the things that they promised, you know, and things. So I think, for me, Raila fitted into kind of that mold, unfortunately, and I think it is important for us. It's a lesson we should learn. You know, it's not to say that he had bad motives, but I think the idea that let's get power first and then we can change, rather than let's first fix a system that regulates power. And then we can put people in. I think for me that would be the issue.
My understanding of Raila Odinga, and closely, not because I worked for him, but because I understood him better. Raila is not the person who sought for power. You can ask anybody who is closer to him. And you can check the sacrifices that Raila Odinga has made. On several occasions, we got disappointed in him because we people who were around him wanted the power. But he was not about the power. I would give you up to the last example when he had to sacrifice his own political ambitions, because when we sat down together with the team, part of the team that was there, I wish I'd never mentioned that, but there was this thing that people said, Ruto has to leave. Yeah. And all of us, yes, Ruto has to leave is a common enemy, and this team want him out, and we want him out, and we want power. And we get to a point, and he says, how will we get that power? When, without going into the details, and he was told, well, let the country be run over. If possible, the military can take over, and such kind of stuff. Then he asked a few questions, and he said, well, as that now we have no constitutional provision for doing an election, because the bill had been passed in Parliament, had not been assented to by the President. We did not have a commission, so how then can we do it? And he said, for us to do anything for this country, we must first of all have fundamental reforms. And if you remember throughout the push, I was part of the team that coordinated the protest in 1996 before I got poisoned, when we were saying IPC must go. And one of the things that we were talking about was fundamental reforms. Raila's priority has always been on reforms.
2016,
2016. His call has always been fundamental reforms. His call has always been on institutionalization of our governance. His call has always been in legalization of our institutional governance. So his priority has not been power. That is the point I wanted to correct.
Just to push back a little bit on this particular narrative, not just like the institutionalization of power, but also the perspective from a lot of people who are outsiders. As a regular Kenyan, people don't interact with power on that level, where you sit at the table and you craft all these ideals. Just before we get to that particular conversation, I want us to just rewind a little bit before we tie this in, is how did the 2002 moment come to be? How did that particularly work out? Because, Tom, what we read and the formulations of that particular process, it looked very different at the time. So I just want both of you to take us through that particular moment to contextualize it before we tie it into like the chase for institutions and making sure that they work. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think for me, and again, I don't speak as somebody who was sat at the tables, you know, as somebody who was observing and to some extent commenting and writing about this. I think you trace back 2002, and I mean, I think you mean the end of Kanu.
Yes, Kibaki-Tosha.
I think you trace it back all the way to the post-1997 elections, the cooperation between NDP and KANU, that then leads Raila into Moi's government. Really, we've got to remember that for a lot of people who were fighting against Moi, that was seen as betrayal. You know, and even when he was running the Constitutional Reform Commission, you know, the government's attempt, if you will, to essentially co-opt the agenda of changing the constitution. You know, at the time when we had the two processes, the Ufungamano one and essentially the government or parliamentary led one. That was seen a lot by, and was opposed by a lot of people. You know, even IPPG was really opposed by people like Kivutha Kibwana. It was seen as government's attempt to co-opt their agenda, you know, and to take it into parliament, which they controlled, you know, and away from, you know, remember we had people-driven constitution. So kind of that's what was seen as they were trying to get away from. And it wasn't actually until the two processes were merged under Professor Guy that we actually got going properly. So I was opposed, and I think it was his going into there. And then when Moi was starting to work out who was the person who was going to replace him in 2002, and he had the four vice president or vice chairman of what was then called New KANU, you know, after it kicked out, he had sidelined people like Kamodho and Saitoti, etc. And he had these four people, and then he picked Uhuru. And in picking Uhuru, then alienated all of these other guys who had been there. Essentially, and that's why I kind of disagree that this wasn't about power. It was always about power. The reason they got pissed is they weren't picked. Yeah. You know, and I think that, so after that, he builds a coalition that stands against Moi within Moi's party. Yeah. You know, and walks out, you know, basically with people like Ntimama, you know, and there's, I think even Kamotho went with him, I'm not wrong. And essentially leaves KANU as a shell, you know. Then has an agreement with Kibaki's NAC, which then becomes the Rainbow Coalition, which is what then, obviously, they had their fights about who they were going to field. Eventually, he said Kibaki Tosha. And that's what set up Kibaki to win the election, you know. So I do think that there is a sense in which we were, he took a stand that was very unpopular, that many people consider to be a betrayal. But in the way it worked out in the end, it ended up hollowing out KANU, which at the time really needed to go, you know, at the time. But I still think that the motivation when he went into KANU was not that, was that eventually he would be, because it was made Secretary General, you know, of KANU, he would be the guy who would be appointed, who would be picked as the successor to Moi. I think that was his goal, but he worked out to our benefit in the end.
That's true, that's true.
Now I'll come back to you, George, because you said he stood very firmly on like making sure the reforms take the fore and not just like chasing power. I agree with you to a point, because we've seen there's various places in this particular fight, at least in his own personal fight, where he showed up like this. Say the Bomas context of 2004, where he was advocating for a parliamentary system where there's a prime minister, but you also can't say if that's what is chasing, who then gets the prime minister position. Isn't that a chasing of power?
I think that should not be a question on the table, because when we institutionalize things, we don't institutionalize them based on personalities.
Okay.
We set them for posterity. Yeah, so that's neither here nor there. But if we talk about what my brother Gathara has just spoken about, I think what informed Raila Odinga's decision was not his movement into KANU. If we go back, Ndugu Gathara, you can remember there were attempts to get Moi out, and they got infiltrated. That is when Jaramogi Oginga Odinga teamed up together with Kenneth Matiba and the rest of the guys and formed a party. And at the last minute, because Moi should have been gotten out of power long before 2002.
In the 92 election,
yeah. But now, this team got infiltrated because they had a standoff of, okay, we push him out, but who becomes the president? And apparently, there are particular cliques that believed they should have been the ones to take on.
It's Matiba who ruined it. Let's be honest. He came back from abroad and essentially refused to be part of it.
Now, there was a repeat in 2002. We find ourselves in similar coalitions, and now we are here with a standoff. A meeting was held until last minute, and there was a disagreement on who is going to be the flag bearer of the coalition. We found ourselves in the previous quagmire. And so somebody has to stake his neck out. The truth is this: when Raila went to the gathering and made a public pronouncement that Kibaki Tosha, he went against the entire team, because after the disagreement on who is going to be the flag bearer, they said, let's go address the people, then we come back and agree. And for him, that was a golden moment. there is no way we will face these people and tell them we have not agreed on who is going to be the flag bearer.
Right.
And so he said, if I declare myself, we are likely to crash this thing. So he sacrificed his own ambition, and he said, well, Kibaki, Tosha. And you see, this was to try and forestall the kind of a crisis we had with his father, Kenneth Matiba, and the rest. And that is how we ended up with the 202. And we also need to understand that if it was basically personal, then Raila would have taken on the presidency after the accident of Kibaki. Because I remember after we did the rally in Machakos and people were driving back to Nairobi and the accident that happened at the junction. And as a political commentator, you must have known the involvement of Raila Odinga in bringing him to the hospital and flying him to the UK. And I remember we had a team with armbands, and he said the captain is injured, but the game has to continue. So he was holding brief for the captain. I know of several times, great politicians of then would confirm what I'm saying. A couple of times, people never believed that Kibaki would make it through. And there are reasons as to why he insisted on Kibaki being out of the country, because they also feared for his life.
Yes.
Because there are people who they believed would have made sure he doesn't get out of that hospital.
Yeah, and there was also like sort of rumors running around about what actually caused the accident.
Yes, what caused the accident. So that is why Raila insisted that he has to be flown to the UK, but then came back and campaigned for him single-handedly.
Yes, no, that's true.
The team.
You know, that's true.
Till,
but you know, at the point we've got to remember that Kibaki had already been settled on as the
flag bearer.
As a flag bearer.
Yes.
And if you start to relitigate that, you know, as you said before, you'd have another 97 moment.
Yes.
I don't think it's 92.
Yes.
97 is the real election where the opposition could never come together. You know, was completely scattered. So I do think that in a sense, Raila was already, I mean, the die had already been cast. They had to go with Kibaki because they'd already settled the men.
But within the team, there was great political disquiet. There are a couple of times that he was asked, how sure are you this guy is okay? And he kept telling people he's okay, he will be back. Yes. Because he had that vision that the man would definitely come back. Even from those who were very close, they never believed in some of the statements that he made, but he kept giving people the hope, and he built that hope to the last day when the elections were won. So there is too much that was being fought for around that particular period of time, because there had to be a change of governance. Now, the reason why they also felt a little disoriented by the appointment of Uhuru Kenyatta, because Uhuru Kenyatta was seen as a weak candidate, and basically a perpetuation of Moi's kind of regime. And so there is no way they would agree for Moi to put in place a puppet that would help in perpetuating his ideologies, in perpetuating his rule.
That's why I'd have a bit of a problem, because if you look at how Raila behaved when he joined KANU, you know, remember when Orengo was doing the Muungano wa Mageuzi rallies, you know, and Raila goes out and says that this is treasonous, what they were doing, you know, which again was seen as, you know, this was our guy, this used to be our person, you know, and now he's turned, you know, against us. And it's not just the only time. You remember when he, even after they got into power with Kibaki, you know, and you had Edward Clay coming out and talking about corruption in government. Raila was one of the people who went after him, you know, him and Martha Karua, you know, especially. So there is a sense in which once he is in power, some of these things that he stood for seem to be fungible, you know, in a sense. That's why in my view, that the talk of that he was a person who stood on principle has to be tempered by a recognition of some of the things that he did when he had access to power, when he was in office, when power was on his side, you know. And I think that to me tells me that there is a sense in which, yes, he might be fighting the good fight, you know, but the means that he uses, you know, seems to me to allow for using power against the very people he's fighting for. And that, for me, I think we have to be careful when we're addressing his legacy, to actually acknowledge that.
I read a statement from a gentleman. He says, great entrepreneurs never retreat. They only advance in a different direction. In political scheming, you look for opportunity to try and advance your course. It doesn't mean that you've retreated. You're only seeking for avenues to advance, but through a different means. One thing, US, I will put this to you. Raila doesn't know how to fight the system in which he is. He is better when he's outside than when he's inside, because he always believes in the leadership of the moment. So he doesn't know how to fight the system in which he is. That is one, is agreed. But also in political scheming, you tell yourself that now that I have this opportunity, I don't want to spoil it. I want to maximize it so that I could achieve my agenda. So you have to know the time when, like in the Bible, they say you temper judgment with mercy. You also have to know when you have to retreat and seek alternative means of advancement. Unlike before, and you realize that is as Raila was maturing, unlike before when if we had to go through this wall, by all means, it has to be through that wall. But wisdom tells us, I read another book in which they're saying that if you keep hitting, I actually wrote it in my book, one of my books, that if you keep hitting the wall for too long, then it is time you stepped back and looked for the door.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. Speaking of the door, yeah, those are very powerful words, but like speaking of a door.
I tend to lean towards both of your understanding. I'm sort of in the middle. Mimi nacheza hapo katikati because yeah, I'm the Kalonzo. Yeah. Na kupita hapo katikati yenu, but I tend to agree that he sought power, and I think that informs a lot.
That's why he ran for president.
Exactly.
Times, you know.
And also
you don't do that if you don't want power.
Exactly, and it also informs a lot of the politics that his contemporaries, quote unquote, because I know there is no person who can reach his level of sway to the public. But then the young people that we see in his party, Sifuna, Babu Owino, and every single person that stands behind him before he died, sought power. And even him in 2018, the Building Bridges initiative and all the handshakes that he's been part of, as much as you say he believed in his power being outside government and sort of checking it, he fundamentally sought for power in his politics. And this is exactly what you see throughout his politics, in everything he says, all his campaigns. But then I badly want to hear what you both think about what I'm about to say right now. That right now, what we have is an opportunity for young people who showed up in the streets last year, to reorganize and restructure politics around the policies and ideas and ideologies that they believe in to be progressive. Raila was a progressive.
You say
but
policy?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I know you'll disagree with that. You'll have the opportunity to make your point clear. But Raila represented a politics that was for patronage before ideology. Every single person that spoke at his burial yesterday said Raila Alinipa. Raila Alinipa, and it was always him. Now that's a problem, because if a young Justine seeks a parliamentary seat in the middle of Kisii, I know she will never, but if she does, if ODM and Raila is not behind Justine, there's a good chance Justine will not advance. And probably Justine was the best candidate for that. So I don't know what you both think about what I've just said right now, but is this an opportunity? And is my assessment of his political career and legacy true?
You asking me? Or?
I think I should start with you. You disagreed with.
Okay. Well, you're saying if ODM and Raila Odinga are not behind Justine, then she would probably not get the seat. Where in the world would she get it? Because you're either a leftist or a rightist, even if you go to America, for example. Okay? You're either Democrat or you're a Republican. So if the party does not endorse you, then definitely you'd most probably try to seek the seat as an independent candidate. So that's a set standard. So, but I honestly believe that one, we need to distinguish between the Gen Z movement, which I have no problem with, because to a larger extent I was involved in it. So, but we need to distinguish distinguish it from what we would refer to as progressive clamor for change. These are two different things.
Could you clarify?
How?
Yeah.
Because if, and I believe any open-minded person would agree with me, oftentimes you ask the young people, what do you want? Now, let me be very honest with you. I believe that we have the younger generation who know what they do not want, but don't know what they want. And that's where the problem is. So if you ask them, Ruto must go, then what next? That's the question. So that is why when you talked about policy, I looked at you and you said, did you just mention policy? Because if there was an ideal moment for the clamor for change to have taken effect was during that Gen Z movement. But none of the young people would have wanted to listen to the fundamental reforms that were required. At that particular point of time, we had a reform process in Parliament, and actually had been passed, a bill had been passed in Parliament that was waiting for presidential assent.
Which bill are you speaking about?
The political, it was called the Political What Act that went into Parliament that Ruto and Raila signed in KICC. I don't know whether you remember that. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. It was later signed in KICC. The reforms that came from the NADCO report that was taken to Parliament, it was something on elections and the electoral reforms. I don't remember exactly which bill it was, but later on it was signed by Raila Odinga and it was signed by the president and Raila witnessed in KICC. And that is what paved way for the appointment of the IEBC commissioners. So at that particular point of time, when you're saying Ruto has to go, and this is a total clamor, the truth is, I now work for Ruto, but at that particular point of time, I wanted him to go. We all wanted him to go, and that is a fact. The point of disagreement is how he was to go. Because if he stepped out, for example, and in his own conscience, he decided that after the raid on Parliament, he was stepping down, what would have become of this country?
Things would have changed, George.
Which, yes,
Doesn't.
okay. Now, I will give you time to oppose what I'm saying and tell me how they would have changed.
Yes.
Number one, we had no commission. We had no IBC commission. Unless you are telling me that then he was to step down and leave Rigathi in power to continue his session, then that would have been a continuation. But is it a continuation that is progressive or retrogressive? But if him and Rigathi, like he made statement when I heard that he's ready to resign with the president, then what would have become of the country? With no fundamental electoral law that is in place, no electoral commission in place. The speaker that would take over for the 90-day period has no authority to make substantive appointments and to sign statutory documents. That means we would never have had an electoral commission. After the expiry of the 90 days, what would have happened? Is it military? There is no country in the world, and you can tell me, that has been ruled for even the shortest time by military and
done well.
And done well. So you're saying you wanted this country to drift into anarchy. And that is the kind of myopia that, for me,
I would be
doesn't
cautious
sell.
not to say that. Gathara?
Well, I approach this a bit differently. I think if you look at what first drove Gen Z guys to the streets in 2024, a lot of it was driven by anger about the finance bill.
Yes.
And it was actually, I think, later on that sort of Ruto must go was kind of tagged on to it. You know, remember the discussions that people were having on Twitter when you had 60,000 people on Twitter talking about tax policy. So I think it was about policy.
It was about policy.
A lot of the discussions that people were having were not about power. And I think this is where we have to be careful and to see it, that what the Gen Zs were proposing was a different way of doing our politics. It's a politics that is regulated, not one that seeks to get power.
Yes.
You know, what George is talking about here a lot of times is about IEBC, about access to power, who rules. Gen Z guys weren't interested in who rules. They weren't interested in sitting with Ruto and horse trading with him. They were saying, this is, we've appointed you, do your job, and stuff. And I would agree with you, there are difficulties, there are questions when it comes to how do we effect some of the things they wanted, but we really shouldn't disregard the fact that they wanted a different way of politics. Don't forget, these are the same people who 2 years before had refused to turn up to vote. And everybody said they were apathetic. But they weren't apathetic, they just saw the vote and this ritual of elections for what it was, as a hoax. We keep voting in people who keep turning against us.
Yes.
So why should we participate in that charade? Our parents have been doing that for 60 years.
You said how many years before?
2 years before, in the 2022 election.
Now, let me give you some statistics. In 2013, okay, we talk about 72.8% of Kenyan population, 35 years and below. In the voting population, we are giving them around 65%. Now, the largest population then falls between the age of 18 and 25, which is around 44-46%. Now, let me amuse you that when we went for elections in 2013, and you can find this out in the Youth Fact Book, the total number of registered voters that voted within that age bracket was 17%. In the next election was in 2017, it was 17.17%. I wish I carried my laptop. I would have given you the records where they are. So it is not just a one-off kind of election. But now, why do I dispute the fact that the young people are about policy? I want to take you back, Justine, for example. In which month did the Gen Z uprising happen?
In June.
In June.
Yes.
And what was it about?
It was about the
finance bill, which I agree with.
It was all policy.
When was the finance bill taken to Parliament?
May? April? It was April?
In April.
Yes.
So if it was all about the finance bill, because now I work at the National Treasury, and part of my responsibility is to try and link what we call the technical aspect with the political processes. Because in as much as the budget making process is technical, the implementation is political largely. So I would tell you, for example, and I asked a question to a group of young people because we held several public forums with the young people. And I asked a question which I do not want to ask Justine on air now, that what is the difference between a finance bill and the budget estimates that is read in Parliament?
Well, the fundamental thing that people understood at that time was that the finance bill was how to collect the money, and the budget was how
the finance bill was how to collect the money.
Yes.
At what point should we have regulated that? I would give you an example right now. I hope you and our viewers included that the process of budget making for the year 2026, 2027 started last month.
That is true.
Now, that is the point at which our voices need to be heard if we are talking about policy and frameworks of regulation. Because when there was the meeting that set up the sector operations towards the budget, and this process is going to run almost towards December when we're doing public participation, before the final document is done, the BROP has been done, and that review is ongoing. That is when most of these things should take place. When you are coming into June, when the budget statement is supposed to be read, the budget statement is the general outlook, the proposals that are put in place. Let me just make my statement clear. What we were fighting was a wrong document, while we should have fought the right document in April. So in as much as we support the Gen Zs, we should also correct the analysis. So that we need to understand that at what point then do we get engaged?
I definitely,
and for me this is fundamental, and I think we need to understand that we never at any point stop having the opportunity to contribute or to say what we want. Democracy is not a thing where you appoint people to rule you. It's about you ruling yourselves and you agreeing this is how we do things, and everything should always reflect what you want. So yes, you've got these forums, these things set up, these processes, but at any point that those processes don't work for you, you can't come out and say it. My point is, it is never too late.
There's never
and that's so. It for me doesn't hold water to say that they should have said it in April.
Gathara,
they
as a
said
political
it in June.
Commentator, Gathara, when was the finance bill passed?
But then,
what does that have to do
just to push
with
back,
whether or not people can actually stand up and say,
just to push
this
back,
is something that we refuse?
Just to push back on your, I think the perspective you have is like Kenyans are supposed to be deeply involved in the entire process from the beginning to the end. And
we need to.
Yes, and that's why I'm saying,
is that
I
not
personally,
the fact?
Yeah, they should be. That's what they were then trying to start doing.
And that's why I want to contextualize the work that I do. I am a satirist. I am a very big Gathara fan. I'll speak from how I've operated. I read something, December. I'm like, I see there's a storm coming. I'm like, this and this has been budgeted over the last year. Most of the money is being wasted on state visits and all these pomp and circumstances things, right? And I'm like, this looks like it's going to be a pattern over the next couple of weeks or months or years if we don't put a stop to it.
True.
Because it's repetitive, right? When I think about like, these are the things that are going to be proposed, even if I don't know the details of when the bills are coming, because sometimes I am Googling and trying to find all these different details on a website. It's because a lot of us are reliant on the internet for information. By the time I figure it out, I am trying to piece it together for it to make sense to as many different people, to even mobilize that kind of pushback on what is happening in the institutions that are already in place and the budgetary process that's already taking place, or the estimates that are being done, and all these involvement processes before even another finance bill is introduced to take to either become the new thing that's going to take place in months to come, right? So in that particular process, the various moments, it's the connection between what is the government saying. Is it saying it to the people in a way that they feel involved, or is it just like numbers that were announced because we expect you to trust us? And I think that's where the disconnect comes. A lot of people have either for failure of maybe the way we've been conducting our politics, and also how it mirrors the way we live our lives within the country, is we abscond duty, right? A lot of people feel like, oh, there's someone else who's doing that work.
It's nonchalant.
Yes, but at the same time, when people get involved, we get the thing that you're saying now, where it's like, why were you not involved earlier? And people start feeling, okay, I'm giving a little bit of perspective.
Justine,
yes,
don't misquote me.
Okay.
I am not saying that when you got involved, then the question should be, why were you not involved from the onset?
But we got those questions.
The question that you need to ask yourself is, why are you not involved from the onset? You see, Justine, let's be very real to ourselves. If we are talking about progressive governance, then we must admit where we are wrong.
Yes.
We are not always right. We must accept where we are wrong, Mr. Gathara. So when we fail in the process, then we have to accept that in this point, we were nonchalant. And we came in way too late. So that in the successive processes, we don't become late. We walk through the process. So that if something is happening, we are able to nip it.
So I really want to ask you this question then.
Yes.
You will remember when people showed up to public participation forums right before the finance bill was passed, and they were not heard. So if your claim is true, then why have a public participation moment if it doesn't matter?
And I am part of the team that did public participation for the last finance bill and the budget. Why was it not opposed?
Why was it not opposed? Because it was a dumped down version of what was there last year. You're comparing two completely different things.
It was not a dumped down thing. The truth is this. If you don't present, I'll give you an example, and I can give you names of organizations that can tell you what they proposed that were captured. We went down up to Bunge la Wananchi to listen to the people, and whatever they said were captured. We were in Kibra late night up to around 1 a.m. to listen to the people, and whatever they said were captured. You understand? Well, I'm not in defense of government. One thing I must also admit is that the previous public participation that led to the last finance bill, not this year's finance bill, was also haphazard. Not thorough engagement per se. You understand? So So those who were doing it were not as proactive as we did it in the 2025, 2026 bills, where we literally went out to the people and reached out to them. So that one I also agree.
What I would say is this, and it goes to the point of participation, you know, that our sovereignty is not caged by these systems that are set up. You know, we are the people always sovereign. That the Constitution always acknowledges that. That's why it allows for a lot of the things that Raila did. You know, when the processes weren't working, he was not afraid to appeal to the sovereigns, the people themselves, and say, well, this actually does not work for us. And there's no recourse to, well, actually you should have done it earlier. No, we are always sovereign. We always dictate. The thing I think that's important for me about the Gen Z things was that they were translating that into a moment of education. You know, so they were going beyond simply the protest. You know, if you looked at what was happening online, was what we long time ago used to call civic education. And we used to think that it is a really difficult thing to do. It is very expensive. We need donor money. These guys were doing it on Twitter, you know, and they had huge crowds, 80,000 people, 60,000 people, talking about policies, talking about laws, you know. And that for me was really important because they were trying to translate the angst they had about this into a moment of changing how we understood and how we participated. You know, and it's unfortunate that government went after them as they did with the abductions and killings and stuff. You know, it's really sad, but I think they have shown resilience. And for me, they stand in opposition to a politics that sought to first get power. They disdained power. They didn't want power. They wanted change. They said change first, then power can come. But Raila's process was more get power, then change comes. But I think that our history has discredited. Don't you remember that lots of people during the Gen Z protests were saying, well, Raila, you fought your fight, leave this to us. They, you know, they shunned it. They didn't want the political class involved in their fight because they had seen what that class does to other struggles. You know, that they become struggles about power, not about change. You know, and I think for me, that is, I mean, that is kind of what we should have been propping up. You know, that's what we should be pushing for as a way for change, rather than looking at politics simply as a pathway for people to attain sort of public power.
And this is my last question to the both of you, considering the journey that Raila's presence has, I think it motivated a lot of people, seeing him mobilize people to go in the streets in whatever that looked like. You were one of those people who showed up without even knowing him. And that part of your brain that's like, okay, there's something that I'm fighting, even if I don't understand, it becomes a part of you. And I think a lot of us who came from places where we saw that happening, you felt like it was possible. And I think that's what Raila represented for a lot of people, even if they didn't understand his personal politics and the journey and the complications of trying to get power, institutionalized power, and all these things. My last question to both of you, and even you, Tom, is, did the presence of Raila in Kenyan politics accelerate personality politics, or and the pitfalls that came with it? Or do we just place blame on him because we want to abscond duty? I'll go with you, Gathara, if I go to George.
Okay. I think we have to give Raila his due. I think he taught us how to challenge power. I think he showed that we could stand up to people like Moi, you know, and he really motivated lots of people to understand that simply wielding power is not the end. That simply being a big man doesn't mean you get your say, that we could collectively challenge the system that exists, you know, and challenge it to the point of changing it. I think he was instrumental in highlighting lots of the problems that we had with our governance, whether it was corruption, whether it was the stealing of elections. I would say that he was robbed of the presidency at least 3 times. Yes. So I do think that he was somebody we could rally around and see as that change was possible. That said, he was also a flawed person. As I've articulated throughout through this show, I thought his approach to what comes back, the fast power or change, was problematic. I do think that he was caught in a historical politics that emphasized ethnicity and personality politics. I think people did build a cult of personality around him, in a sense, he did perpetuate some of the really problematic parts of Kenyan politics. I think he was part of it. So for me, that's why I wrote in my article that I think it was less mystery and more mirror. He mirrors the contradictions within Kenya, a country that was born in this hope, but has always sort of seen that hope betrayed. I think Raila created this hope, had this opportunity to do big things, and he did do big things, but eventually almost succumbed to the system that he was fighting, and became a part of it, especially at the very end. And I think that in a way, for me, encapsulates the tragedy of what Kenya is.
Yes, and to you, George.
Well, I would talk of a different Raila Odinga. I would talk about not a builder of his own individual personality, but a builder of other personalities. The personalities that he did not just prop up, but he also financed. And this, I am saying, not from outside perspectives. A couple of times, I would give you, for example, in the 2013 elections, I remember when he picked Juma Boy Juma, in one single incident when Juma joined us and spoke publicly, and Mzee loved the oratory skills, and he asked us to get Juma onto the next flight with him to the next place, and he did not even have money for campaigns. Those who are around there know. And I know I was given money from the office, from his campaign team more than once to send to him. I remember him financing Chizuga. I remember him financing a couple of, up to and including last elections. I could mention names of politicians that some of the last ones got around 10 million each. When somewhere in Serena, they got 10 million Kenyan shillings. I mean, he picked personalities, he built the personalities, he nurtured the personalities, and he raised the personalities. So the love for Raila Odinga was not just what he did as a politician to push for the changes and the transformations, but most people were endeared towards him by virtue of what he did to them. So he spent time nurturing and raising leadership and raising people of different cultures. Yeah. And you see, I could mention them from the coast region all through to central Kenya, and I would take you to Rift Valley and all through to Nyanza. So he identified potential where he could see it, and he helped to prop that potential, and not just prop it, but also to finance that potential to become what it is. So by the time he's departing, he's not departing as Raila Odinga. Like I mentioned to some of us when we were home, I said Raila Odinga has not died. He has rested, but he is waking up in so many other people that he has spent time nurturing, building, and raising.
Okay. Yeah. My question then to you would be, and our producer is also very keen on this question, is what happens to ODM now? We saw a bunch of speeches during the funeral, during his funeral, like his last moments, with not just the Kenyan collective, but people who are supposed to be his friends and compatriots, and like the people who've walked with him in the fight. What then happens to ODM? Because the rumors are not good, so we would like to hear from someone who is familiar with how the restructuring of the party could look like.
There is no restructuring of the party. The party is structured. ODM is the only and you can take this to the bank, is the only party with an elaborate structure. And this is how the ODM structure is set in place. The ODM structure is set in place from the polling stations. I think unlike most of the other political parties that we have 30 officials at every polling station. For example, my constituency where I vote is Kajiado North. We have 210 polling stations. Each polling station has 30 officials. These 30 officials, you see, we consider the polling stations as the villages. So the villages gather together and they choose who are going to lead us in this party, in this village. And they appoint, they elect basically these 30 people. And the electoral laws of ODM are very clear. You say election shall be through secret ballot or any other means adopted on the floor of the House, whereby we have one acclamation and we have two consensus. So the means, whichever, the means that is adopted by the people gives us the 30 officials. These 30 officials, now all these villages, what we refer to as the polling stations, would now gather together at the ward level to set up the ward office. Then the ward office, for example, now we have 5 wards in my constituency. They will also elect their own leaders at the polling stations, and not at the polling station, now at the ward level, and set up a ward office. The wards now, the 5 wards will now meet together again, all the officials elected, to form the constituency office. Now, those elected at the constituencies would now meet again to form the county, and it goes up to the NDC and form the national office.
Okay, that makes sense. Like they would have a proper structure to make sure there's...
Now, I'm going up.
Yes.
So up there, we have the structure that runs the ODM. We have the secretariat that is led by an executive director. That is the day-to-day running of the party. But after that, we have the NEC. NEC is formed from down here, the National Executive Council. That is the organ that makes decisions on the day-to-day running of the party. But we still have what we refer to as the Central Committee that now involves the NEC and senior government officials, elected officials. Then it goes back down to what we call the National Governing Council before it comes to the NDC. So the decision of how ODM would run is not made by a single individual. It's made by the set organs of the party. So if any change has to happen today, it would not be made by an individual. So that, for example, we have our chair, who is Gladys Wanga, the governor. She can't come up and say, now this is the way we will go. Let me be honest with you. Even before the pronouncement of the acting party leader was done, that morning there was a NEC meeting in Agile. The NEC meeting in Agile is the one that agreed, let's have Dr. Oburu Oginga as the acting party leader. And why is he acting party leader? Because the decision of who becomes the party leader must be done by the NDC. But now NEC has to step in because there should be no vacuum of leadership. So you realize I'm taking you back to the fact that NEC had to make a decision on who becomes the acting party leader. But after the NEC, this thing will go to the Central Committee, the National Governing Council, and it goes to the NDC for us to define the changes in the party. There is no change in the party that can, and if it is substantive change, including the change of the party's constitution, it has to go to the NDC. So ODM is well structured with leaders that are in position, structures that are in place. As to whether some of the political leaders would influence the process is a matter for discussion, because, well, if a politician has a way of influencing the process, you can't stop that.
And I think for me, there is the structural description of ODM.
Yes.
But I would argue there's a political description of ODM, that it was Baba's party. And it essentially did what Baba wanted. And I think where we are now is kind of an ODM that has to decide for itself what its identity is as a party without Raila. And in a sense, removing Raila from there gives ODM an opportunity to actually not be just a vehicle for somebody, as most of our, it's not just ODM, most of our parties are vehicles for personalities. You know, I don't think anybody would argue. I mean, I'm sure if you got Ruto here today, he'll tell you how UDA has all these structures, but we know it's his party. We know Jubilee was Kenyatta's party. You know, so my point is, once that is removed, once now Raila has departed the scene, what's left can actually sit back and decide. Does it want to be the vehicle of somebody else's ambition? Or does it want to use the structures that you have articulated to actually set out a different way of being? You know, and I think kind of that would harken back to what ODM was at its founding. You know, when it wasn't just one person running it, you know, essentially in charge of it, but you had five. You know, you had the Pentagons. You had kind of like these personalities that were sort of, in a sense, checking one another, or could check one another, you know. So I think it is really for us to, I mean, for ODM to decide for itself, which is the route it wants to go, what is the sort of party it wants to become, you know, and whether it can actually tear itself away from the tradition of Kenyan politics and how Kenyan political parties have been for the last 60 years, to becoming a much more modern, a much more, well, not really modern, but a much, let's say, a more democratic, if you will, a more a party that's more accountable to its grassroots rather than to its leaders. You know.
I think, Gathara, you're speaking about what you don't know. And you're speaking about a Raila you don't know. The truth is this: I can tell you several instances in which the party leadership disagreed with Raila Odinga. If we had time, I could, and you see, I know this is being watched. Yes. I could highlight one by one the instances in which the party has disagreed with Raila Odinga. Raila Odinga was not.
You can give us an instance. You can give us two instances.
Raila Odinga was not just a god that had this ultimate decision of the party. The Raila Odinga I know gave people time to express themselves and to make decisions by themselves. The last one I would give you is the postponement of the ODM at 20 celebration. If Raila Odinga did not give time to the committee to make decisions, then he would have just stood and made pronouncement. But Raila Odinga called the committee. There was a committee that was put in place, chaired by Junet Mohammed, to prepare for the ODM at 20 elections. And when he called the meeting, and he said, well, it is your call. You continue or you hold. If he's the one who had to make the calls, he would have just called the people and he said, well, ODM at 20 is postponed. Most of the decisions that are made by ODM have to emanate through NEC and go through the National Governing Council, go through the councils that have been set in place by ODM before a decision is made. Even if Raila had an idea of what he wanted to do, he would not make a pronouncement. He has to take it through the process.
Well, anyway, I mean, we can go over this for a while, but I mean, you can go to the statements of people like Sifuna, who's I think he's the Secretary General, isn't he?
Yes.
And he was saying, we go where Baba leads. Where Baba says is what we do. You know, so these are there. These are not things that we make up.
Unless you're not an analytical journalist. Those are public political pronouncements.
But they matter. They matter.
For example, I have stood and made decisions and I said, I would give you this. I have said that if Raila goes to hell, I go to hell.
Why would you say that if you don't mean it? Why would you say that if you don't mean it?
I mean,
your opening was a strong batting for him. So we really are in a position where
that's politics. The same man who is telling.
That's why I say. And remember, I said
no. Let me ask Gathara. I want to ask you that question. Okay, if you think that Sifuna meant what he said, that where Raila leads is where we go, why has he opposed the decision of being in
government?
But he was there. Because he was there when the contract was signed, right?
Yeah.
Why had to be there?
and
He was
the party,
unwillingly there.
And more importantly,
No,
the
not-
party went where he wanted.
He was visibly.
Yeah.
So that is the question I ask you. He's actually shooting himself in the leg. You are referring to an individual who has openly showed defiance to the party's collective
but the
position.
party ended up where Raila wanted.
Went.
And that's my point, is that it was always Raila's party. And I think it's actually going
Gathara,
to be...
if you forget, don't misquote Raila Odinga. If you forget, before this process began, there were consultative processes that were held in counties. Please refer to even to the media outlets. There were consultative processes that went through the counties, and Raila met with county leaderships throughout the country before he met with William Samoei Ruto. Before a decision of the party was made. If I'm lying, you can say.
We can go on and on about this.
Speaking of things that were done, unfortunately, during I think it's the day of the announcement of Raila Odinga's pass.
Yes, I think it was the day.
It was the day of in the morning.
Or the day before.
When we were getting the news about Raila's passing, we were also getting 8 new laws. I think Tom will take us through all the laws that were signed.
And I think I would have something to say if we had time, George, about these laws, and particularly 1 or 2 of these laws which are questionable, given his stance for free speech and all these things. This thing went through first reading, second reading, and all these processes while he was still alive as the leader of the party. And he didn't speak up about it, but then that's a conversation that we can maybe have as time goes. So, as Justina said, 8 bills were signed into law by the president. That's the Virtual Asset Service Providers Bill, Computer Misuse.
National Treasury.
Yes, that's National Treasury. And then Computer Misuse and Cybercrime Bill, that's not Treasury,
Security.
That's Security Interior. And then the Air Passenger Service Charge, that's Treasury. Privatization Bill, Treasury. The National Land Commission, not Treasury, that's the Ministry of Lands. The Land Bill 2024, that's Ministry of Land as well. Wildlife, Conservation and Management, that's the Tourism and probably Wildlife.
That's Wildlife.
That's Wildlife. A National Police Service Commission, that's Interior. So, in particular, the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act, which outlaws quote-unquote threatening, or any language that can be construed as threatening to anyone, which can cause possible harm to them. And this was introduced in August, right after the protest in June, which saw a lot of MPs and senators, and even Raila himself, being demurred. So this comes at a questionable time, unfortunately, right after he dies, and it's a result of a parliament that went where he went, and he unfortunately went towards President Ruto's side at this time. But 2 bills, this one and the Land Bill 2024 and the National Land Commission Bill 2023, which removes some powers from independent authorities and places it. Yes, and the privatization bill, which removes power from authorities which are considered independent to the Office of Cabinet Secretaries, which can be the direct influence of the president. So, and the Computer Misuse Cybercrime Bill, I'd love to hear both of your opinions on this, and Justine, that this leaves a lot of room for interpretation that can be anti-democratic. I don't know what you both feel about this particular bill.
Just briefly.
Yeah, briefly, because we're running out of time.
Well, I think that it does create room for mischief, and even the people who are pushing it, some of the examples I was saying in Parliament about it, a lot was sort of the ability of youth to both mobilize on the street, the ability to express views that would not necessarily be, the government might not be happy about. We have seen the targeting of people even for simply doing cartoons online. So I think whenever you have laws that create space for government to oppress, it will oppress. It has been a lesson for Kenya throughout. We are told we are passing laws to protect us against terrorism. We find they are really laws to protect the government from us.
People.
You know, so I think we need to be much more vigilant and need to be pushing back against the adoption of these laws. I'm not sure whether there's still a case in court about this, and I know last year there had been one had been filed.
Yeah.
You know, so hopefully. Courts don't always have a very good track record here, but hopefully they roll back some of this. But I do want to talk about the privatization bill, you know, because when we remove Parliament from Parliament, the oversight over the whole transaction, and we simply center it within government, then we are actually sort of setting ourselves up for problems, you know, up ahead, because the executive cannot always be trusted, and our history has been that lots of the problems, whether it's corruption and the theft of resources, happens where the executive is, you know. So for as long as this is left to them, to their discretion, whether it's at cabinet level and then cabinet secretary, deciding which of our parastatals are going to be privatized to whom, you know, and then the whole process of it, I find that it is, some of the things that it doesn't secure for me are problematic. Yes. Because we are taking what is communally owned and essentially letting a few individuals buy into it. But we don't regulate that, you know, that this should be as broad, the ownership should be as open to as broad a category of people as possible, you know. There is no, I don't find in the bill that there is an actual, anything to actually incentivize that. So it ends up concentrating lots of power in individuals, and it's already going to be individuals who already have power, who already have wealth, who are going to buy into these things. Yes, it is being floated on the stock exchange, you know, but if most Kenyans don't have the cash, it will go to the people with it, you know. And that is my problem, is I think we need to be careful about these concentrations of power and resources in people that would be the product of this. We should learn from what happened in places like Russia when they did that.
Oligarchs.
You know, you can see what the power that American oligarchs are having in the U.S. You know, so these concentrations are something that, for me, really worry me. You know, and finally, I was reading in The Nation that the last successful IPO we had floated was Safaricom. You know, remember Safaricom was very problematic. There was 10% of it that we never knew, you know, where it went with people like Mobitel, EA, etc. You know, so it's really, really important that we have our eyes on what government is doing, you know, and the more that they remove the people who can engage and stop them and simply sequester it within the executive, the more worried I become.
The more we need to have our eyes on what the government is doing. I agree with you. And that has been my challenge even with the Gen Z's movement. So the question I need to ask you is, did you just wake up on Wednesday and realize the bills were there?
No.
No.
People have been voicing their dissent.
People have been voicing their consent.
Thank you. And this is what I have said, and I keep repeating. We must own up to our civic duty as Kenyans. And that is why I started with his own statement. We must keep watch of what the government is doing. If we really had a problem with some of these things, it should not be left to particular voices. That it will either be Okiya Omtata, it would be Gathara, it would be who. It must be a collective voicing of our disagreement with what the government is doing. Like the way the Gen Zs came up collectively to voice their concerns, then Kenyans should have also come collectively to voice concerns with certain things. We should not wait till the tail end of a process to now start the clamor for the changes. That I don't agree with.
Well, I hear you.
Well, lastly, I would also want to say, well, laws are for interpretation. and the extent to which you understand or interpret the laws. I'm not a lawyer. I am a journalist by training. I'm not a lawyer. I am a leader by training because I did leadership, then I did journalism. So I'm not a lawyer. But I understand that laws are for interpretation. And one law has to be interpreted with another. You contextualize the law. If we talk about threat today, I would give you a very perfect example that the president could declare a state of nation when there is a threat on the nation. The threat on our security, the question you need to ask yourself is, what then would the legal people define as a threat? I mean, so some of these things, well, they also say legally that every law or legal provision has what they call as a lacuna that allows them to play with it. So it is us as a people to try and seek what is the right interpretation. The only problem is that the makers of the law themselves do not interpret the law. It is another arm of the government that is given to be interpreting that law.
Yes.
So whether it will serve the interest of the politicians or the ruling elites or not would now be fundamentally determined by the arm that is given the mandate to interpret the law.
Yes, and that's why I said that it's record in interpreting it.
Yes.
No, it's questionable.
But there's one thing I should say.
So as I conclude, well, we are to blame because we always say, but Gathara, you have to agree with me. It is a Kenyan problem. In everything we do, we always wait till the last minute. Whether it is registering a vote,
that's a very unfair assumption.
This is what I'm saying.
It's not an assumption.
This is the problem that I'm pointing to. And I've been saying this from the start, that how we exercise our sovereignty is not what is regulated by the Constitution. The Constitution is how other people we delegate to exercise it.
Yes.
It's how the state exercises it. We are sovereign, and at whatever point we choose to engage, our engagement matters, at that point. I think that in the case of, I agree with you, people should constantly be vigilant.
That is the fact.
But I would reverse the burden. I would say it is not for us to seek to put our views to the state. It is the state to seek to get our views.
Yes.
The way our laws are written, so for example, public participation, there is no measure of when we write our law, when they do public participation, they'll come back and say, these are the views we got and this is how they are reflected in our rule. We give them views, they decide.
Whether to take it or not.
They have complete discretion. And all they have to do is do the ritual of, people turned up at this place.
Yes.
Now,
public participation for me, and that's what I'm saying, that people are participating constantly. When they sit on Twitter and have an argument, they are participating. It is the job of government to go and hoover that up. And not only in this small window, but constantly seeking to find out, because if it is governance by consent, not by coercion, then it should be up to them to constantly figure out, do people consent? Do they consent to this? So when you're passing a law in Parliament and people are fighting it outside and you're shooting them, clearly you are not.
The laws we are talking about now, Gathara, let's contextualize our discussion. The laws we are talking about now, nobody fought over them.
The people did.
That is very inaccurate.
It's just that you're not seeing them on the street.
I would say.
But they're on Twitter fighting them.
Who was shot?
No, I'm saying, so for example, I was giving an
terrifying.
example of what happened in 2024 and again in 25. So you've got Parliament passing a law. And I was just giving that as an example of where I think rule by consent is undermined.
Yes.
Unfortunately, as much as I would like us to go to bat for every single moment that we are kind of holding time for.
Raila. We discussed it quarter time.
We actually did discuss Raila.
And I think at its core, before I give you the final word on what the future looks like without Raila in our political scene, I would just like to say, I don't know if a lot of people have seen this story, but Kenya is looking to diversify its gold reserves, and they are looking to buy gold, and that gold will be stored in the Bank of England. And I'm so happy that we've come so far with our colonization journey. We're just giving them gold back. So shout out to Kenyans. So as we wrap up right now, I would just like a take from every single one of you on where our country goes now that Raila is no longer in the political scene. People can't point fingers and say that person has been standing there too long, I can't vote for him, or this is what the opposition looks like, this is what the government should look like. We no longer have a crutch. It no longer exists for everyone who wanted him to save them, for everyone who wanted him to continue being the voice that stops the government from crushing them. He's not there anymore. The weight of his work is still with us, as George said. So I would like each and every person to just contextualize what Kenya's political future looks like now that Raila is not with us anymore. I'll go with Gathara and then George and then Tom.
Very briefly, I think we have an opportunity to build on what Raila leaves behind, both the problematic aspects and the really great things that he achieved. I think we have an opportunity to build a new way of doing politics. I think that we were already on that journey, as I've articulated with the case of how the Gen Z's revolution, as I call it, started and moved, and it was already in a sense beyond him, so I think he lives at a point where we've already started on the journey of building a new politics. The question is whether that politics is going to be, as Raila himself was, be drawn back into what already exists. So today we are again hearing sort of the emergence of this idea of personalities driving this, let's get Maraga, let's get Omtata, those are the people in charge. No, it has to be kept as a politics of the people, of where everybody participates, everybody takes charge. As I said, democracy is not about appointing people to rule you, it's about ruling yourselves. And to do that, you have to be engaged. You have to figure out what government is doing, as George said. You have to keep an eye on that, and you have to be constantly feeding back, and looking to change the system that exists, not just the people who are running it. That system is a problem. That's why we keep electing people and they keep turning against us. Fix the system first, change the rules first, change the incentives first. And then you can, whoever you elect, you can hold them to account. I think that if we can take our route, our politics through that route, then we'd be in a much better place. And I think then we would be able to honor Raila for what he did, with the problematics that he did, by actually producing a country where the exercise of public power is regulated by a system that we have put in, and that system is itself held to account by the participation, active participation of the people that it governs.
And to you, George.
Well, Raila has always fought for institutionalization of our organs, and his cry fundamentally has always been on reforms of our policy frameworks. I hope that we will not keep pushing the kind of an uninformed, or let me not call it uninformed, let me say the kind of knee-jerk reactions at the latter moments to try and push agenda. But I hope that with his departure, then we would most probably become more proactive in following through the process to ensure that if we are talking about institutionalization of our organs, we are talking about the legal provisions, the fundamental reforms, they are done accurately and as should serve the people of Kenya. That is my greatest cry. The truth is, Raila is gone. Let's wait and see whether it was about Raila Odinga or it was about the people.
Only time will tell.
Yeah.
Only time will tell.
Yeah. And you, Tom?
That's it. Only time will tell.
Generational
Only time will tell. I think the man represented a lot of things. The reason we're here speaking about him is because millions of people resonated with things he said in stages. Much as a good percentage of us also disagreed, a lot of people felt represented by him. And I think it's important for all of us to honor that, but also not get lost in the valorizing of Raila to a point where we forget about parts of him that contributed to the problems we live in right now. And I think the solution to that, aside from pointing fingers at him, because there's nothing that comes out of that, is to seek to change those things that he stood for that we disagreed with. He very much campaigned for the constitution that we have that gives us a lot of liberties. Let's fight for that constitution to keep those liberties. I think he represented a lot of things. It's important for all of us to just let all those things shine through and get rid of the bad things and keep the good things.
Okay, that's actually very nice. I would like to say last words, but I don't want my last words to be my last words, so I would give everyone 3 words of how you would remember Raila. 3 words, only 3.
Oh,
Yeah.
I don't know how I would reduce it to 3, but I mean, a complex man. I think. I mean, there's a time he was described by one of the in 2007. You remember? Was it? Forgot his name when he was saying ODM stands for one dangerous man. But I don't think that was true or that was ever true. I think he was a complex man. I think he was a complex individual who wanted the best. I'm quite happy to acknowledge that he wanted the best for this country. But obviously I had issues with some of how he went about securing that. So complex, yes, that for me would kind of handle it.
And for you, George?
Let me put it to you into perspective. He was not called complex. He was called mysterious.
He wasn't mysterious.
In my place, they call him Agwambo, which means the mysterious one. Well, as for me, how will I remember him? In 3 words, he made me.
Okay.
Yes.
That is a very strong...
Yes, it is.
Tom Ukona.
I'll go a different way. You guys made proper phrases videos. I'll just go the very ungrammatical way of saying it. I'd say brave, charismatic, and finally, he was a politician.
That's really good. To me, I'll just say he was courageous, contradictory, and fun. He was actually a lot of fun.
We can fun being with.
Consensus. We did it, guys. We did it. He was a fun man. So,
Fun being with.
Yeah. So I want to thank everyone who joined us today. I want to thank George for. I want to thank George for joining us. I want to thank Gathara for joining us, and for my co-host.
Tom.
And for me, Justin Wanda, will say good night.